Hello and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tariq Ahmed. The Arabs used to have a prayer. Oh Allah, protect us from every Tariq, except the one who brings good. So it's important for me to ask Allah to make me a Tariq who brings good to you through this podcast. This is episode 4 of the podcast series, The Democratic Way, which you can subscribe to at my Substack, taraqa, taraqa.substack.com. Or you can follow this podcast series because it's simultaneously uploaded to YouTube at the channel Freed by Islam. So thank you so much for coming to this podcast series. And my desire to bring good to you is part of why we're also going to talk about this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The hadith is kindness is not to be found in anything, but that it adds to its beauty, and it is not withdrawn from anything, but it makes it defective. And that's an important reminder to myself because of the subject matter. Our subject matter is politics, in particular, U.S. presidential politics. And that is something that has been bereft of kindness for decades, frankly. And it's gotten worse and worse over time. There have been tragedies in the past, but just this year, within the last year, we've had assassinations and assassination attempts. The importance of restoring kindness to our discourse, I don't think it can be overstated. So, with that in mind, at no time in this podcast do I want anyone to think that I'm pointing fingers and attaching blameworthiness to anyone, not to any party, not to any person. I'm honestly going to try to be as kind as I can. And that means also, for the most part, doing what I can to say what people have done that was good, and also to not ascribe intentions that I couldn't possibly speak to, what a person's intentions were. That's something God can do. That's not something I can do. So let's talk about what the last question I asked you in the previous episode was, do you feel like it's possible that the Democratic Party had its thumb on the scale in the 2020 election? This is the 2020. I know some of you could have thought this was 2024 because Joe Biden was the Democratic Party candidate in 2024 until he finally stepped down. But in 2020, he ran against a crowded field of candidates in the primaries, which were contested right up until the convention. And yet, I would ask you, do you think it's possible that the Democratic Party leadership had its thumb on the scale? And to understand why the answer to that question is definitely yes, like without a doubt, yes, we need a quick history lesson, and we need to jump back in time to this choice that the Democratic Party faced in 1968. And to be honest, the Democratic Party convention choice was between Humphrey and McCarthy. But even to understand the gravity, and when I said the 1968 Democratic Convention, I wasn't alive then. Most of the people watching this podcast were not alive then, I would guess. I mean, I don't know my demographic. I don't have any study on that. But my guess is that if I wasn't alive then and you're watching this, chances are, unless you're my mom, that you weren't alive then either. So, 1968, it's important to know if you're not, if the words didn't automatically bring it back to your mind from dramas that you've watched or from movies or from textbooks, I would hope, or from just history books, maybe you're a history buff. If it didn't come back to your mind automatically that 1968 was a traumatic year for the United States, I want to let you know it was one of the most traumatic times in U.S. history. Because, and just in a short space of time, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Before this convention, he was assassinated. There's a face missing on this slide. At the convention, the choice was between Humphrey and McCarthy. But 1968 is a year of not just the assassination of King, but also the political assassination of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, the president who had been assassinated a few years before. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. He was also running for the Democratic nomination. And because of the rules at the time in the Democratic Party, he had pretty much as much of a shot as McCarthy, really. And that's because in 1968, the Democratic Party rules were different than in 2020 or in 2024. And I'm not opposed to that. I believe it's important that the law protect the right of political parties to organize the way that they want to organize. I think it's important for us to have freedom, to guarantee freedom through political parties, to let the parties have that kind of power that they choose their own process for nominating candidates. I don't think that we should meddle with the mechanics of that. I think as voters, we should demand democracy, because when we don't demand democracy, we won't get it. You know, I hope that's said as kindly as I can. If we don't demand democracy, we won't get it. And that's very, very important in 1968. So the process in 1968 allowed Humphrey, who was a pro-war candidate, and the country was at war in 1968 too. The Vietnam War, which was a traumatic experience for the country. And I'm not just talking about Vietnam, it's traumatic for the United States. The pro-war candidate Humphrey was able to be the front runner for the nomination without ever entering a single primary. That's the rules of the Democratic Party allowed that in 1968. The other person pictured on the screen, he and Bobby Kennedy faced off in primaries. When Kennedy was assassinated, those delegates were able to choose other. He obviously lost those candidates, those delegates, and party rules allowed them to end up going to Humphrey, and that caused a huge amount of upset, right? Because we have Eugene McCarthy, who is running against the war, and we have Hubert Humphrey, who is running for the war. And the masses of people who had voted hoping to send the message that they didn't want war. War was very unpopular in the United States, especially among Democrats, especially among younger Democrats. The amount of pain that the country was feeling at the time caused riots to break out during the 1968 convention. People will debate perhaps whether Richard Daley, his response, he was the mayor of Chicago where the convention was taking place in 1968, whether his response was appropriate or inappropriate. They may debate that. But his forces clashed with the protesters. The protests were violent riots as a result of the contact with police. So you have trauma outside the convention. You have a dramatic story playing out inside the convention, as McCarthy really feels that it's not fair for him to lose since he ran in the primaries and Humphrey didn't. But nothing that took place was against the rules, right? I mean, they didn't break any laws, and they chose a candidate according to what the rules of the convention allowed, what the rules of the party allowed. The Democratic Party, to its credit, did something wonderful after that trauma. I mean, that trauma, that was so visceral. They did something wonderful. They formed a commission. And that commission ran from 1968 through, I think it may have lasted past 1971, but it was led by George McGovern, who ended up becoming the Democratic nominee in 1972. He left the commission that had his name on it. He left the commission in 1971 to run for that nomination. And he ran as an anti-war candidate. And he ran against Hubert Humphrey, who was seeking that nomination again in 1972. The commission that came out of the 1968 trauma decided that the party process for choosing a candidate should be more democratic. That people should be able to vote in primaries. And so primaries became ascendant. Primaries became the primary way, if you will, to choose that nominee. And McGovern's people were young, they were enthusiastic, they were prolific. They ran a great campaign, and he became the nominee, which upset the party leadership in as much as they had wanted it to be Humphrey. Humphrey and McGovern had been friends. I'm not saying that McGovern came out of left field. He himself, and this is wonderful, you really need to see this interview. Democracy Now!, which is a fabulous news source, and you really should get your news from there if you want independent journalism. If you don't want journalism that is bought and paid for, then you need to watch Democracy Now! And if you look up in 2008, the interview that Amy Goodman did of George McGovern. In 2008, he was a surrogate for Hillary Clinton, who was running at the time for the Democratic nomination. That interview includes him, and it includes Jim Hightower, who was the surrogate for Barack Obama at the time, or one of the surrogates. They were each one of the surrogates, not the surrogate. So anyway, they appear on Democracy Now! It's a phenomenal interview. Amy Goodman asks him about 1968, asks him about 1972, right? And McGovern points out that he was an insider in the party. He was like the leader, like the founder, not the founder, but he put his heart and soul into the Democratic Party in his home state. And that is part of why that party trusted him with the commission. And he became the nominee. Now, some people will say that the 72 election went for Nixon because the party abandoned McGovern when it came to running against Nixon. There are so many documentaries about the 68 convention and about the 72 election. I recommend them both. I recommend all of those documentaries to you. The point here is that the party had made that decision to allow democracy to rule in the choice. And McGovern took advantage of that and won. In 76, it was Jimmy Carter who benefited. 72 was equally traumatic, right? Because Nixon had to resign in disgrace for Watergate. And that's a whole other episode that we might come back to. But 76 is Jimmy Carter's turn. And Jimmy Carter wins that election. Now Jimmy Carter becomes the incumbent president. And in 80, he gets challenged. And all this time, the Democratic Party rules allow for primaries to be ascendant, right? They're not happy with the results. Election after election, they're not happy with the results, but they allow it. In 80, Ted Kennedy decided to run. Edward Kennedy, the younger brother of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, both who had been assassinated. This is an incredibly emotional election now because of that, just because of the previous assassinations in his family. And Ted Kennedy ran against Jimmy Carter. The party leaders would eventually decide this was too much. that primary was so contentious and so emotional that it drained the party, that it helped Ronald Reagan to beat Jimmy Carter. Put that aside for the moment. What's so important, and what we're going to end on here, is that the Democratic Party decided to walk back from just allowing democracy to pick its candidate for it. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the word superdelegate in the next episode of this podcast series. Thank you so much for your time and for watching this series. I hope that you're benefiting from it. I hope that it brings good.